Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast, where we provide you with your weekly diagnosis of everything fantasy football. Whether it's season-long leagues, dynasty, DFS, or sometimes even IDP, we got you covered all year long. Let's do it. Let's get to it. Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast. It is Tuesday, January 14th, 2025. I'm your host, Jon Jeune. And while I'm here, happy birthday to my little brother, Randy Jeune. Appreciate you. Love you with all my heart, little bro. And I hope that 2025 is great to you. But by the way, I just had to throw that out there because I realized the date as I'm sitting here recording, I could not do it for my little bro. So, but I'm Jon Jeune. It's a Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast. And probably haven't heard my voice, seen my face in a while. If you were watching live on YouTube, Twitch, X, Instagram, Spotify video. Well, you can't watch live on Spotify video, but you can watch on Spotify video. Or if you listen to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you get your podcast. I took the week off last week, as I mentioned. Had to, just sit back, take a break. But I'm back. Right now I'm back, and so you're probably wondering what's the cadence going to look like for the rest of this off season, and we're going to get into all of that stuff. Right, we're going to get into today is the accountability show, right? But we also going to recap 2024. We're also going to look ahead to the 2025 off season and what that looks like. And then we're also going to talk some ball, talk some of the recap, some of the wild card. And we're going to talk through some, very briefly what the divisional round is going to look like, what to expect there as well. So with that being said, let's kind of just jump into it by quickly recapping 2024 from a fantasy football perspective. And we'll start with the quarterback position. And the top three quarterbacks, your top three quarterbacks in fantasy football for 2024 season. And the way I'm doing this, I know lots of times, we like to do points per game, and totally that makes sense. But total points also, if we're looking at a whole summation of the season, right, total points definitely, I think, tells a story. Points per game tells, a different story based on if we're looking at if a certain guy got put into the lineup at a certain point, then points per game helps tell that story. If a guy had, something changed, maybe his role changed, or maybe, there was a coaching change, or coordinator change, or there's the way the team was calling plays, we might look at, hey, from this week to this week, this player is averaging this many points per game. So it helps tell that story. But I think total fantasy points helps tell a season-long story in terms of, where were these guys? How did they finish? Who were the guys that we were able to count on week in and week out for most weeks? Right. And obviously there's context within every story, and context does matter, as I often say in these off-season shows, which technically this is an off-season show. So let's jump into it. Right. So the top three guys from a fantasy football perspective, total points at the quarterback position this year. QB1, you're QB1, and the most likely to be MVP, Lamar Jackson. And I know there's a debate going around about whether Lamar Jackson or the number 2 quarterback in fantasy, Josh Allen, deserve to be the NFL MVP. And in my mind, it is clear as day who the NFL MVP needs to be. It needs to be Lamar Jackson. I don't think there's any way around that. Sorry, guys, my camera is bugging out here. And did I just... Sorry, guys, had a little bit of a technical difficulty there. My camera was bugging out, but we're back. We're back. So I don't think it's any debate about who the MVP needs to be. I think it needs to be Lamar Jackson. I mean, when you just look at his numbers compared to the numbers of Josh Allen. I mean, Josh Allen had a great year, don't get me wrong, as did the QB3, also had a great year. Do not get me wrong. But if you look at the total numbers throughout the season, Josh Allen 3,731 passing yards, Lamar Jackson, 4,172 passing yards. Josh Allen, yards per attempt, 7.7, Lamar Jackson, 8.8. Lamar Jackson, 66.7% completion percentage. Josh Allen, 63.6. Lamar Jackson, 45 total touchdowns. Josh Allen, 41 total touchdowns. Lamar Jackson, 915 rushing yards. Josh Allen, 531 rushing yards. I don't think it's a debate. I think it's clearly Lamar Jackson, and he will be the third MVP by the time this is said and done. Was the first team All-Pro quarterback. That usually yields an MVP. So we'll see what happens there. The QB3 on the year would be Joe Burrow. Had a great year. If only the Bengals can get out of this having slow starts, then maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't be watching the playoffs from the outside here. Moving on to the top 12 quarterbacks, rounding out these top 12 quarterbacks. Jaden Daniels, the rookie, coming in as the quarterback 4. And by the way, these top 12s and all these fantasy rankings are coming from weeks 1 through 17 because that is the real fantasy season. Even though I was on here for a week 18 podcast giving out fantasy advice, but from when we look at season totals, it's always going to be week 1 of week 17 because week 18 is such an anomaly. But Jaden Daniels, again, the rookie coming in at QB4, Baker Mayfield coming in at QB5, Jared Goff 6, Jalen Hurts 7, Sam Darnold 8, Bo Nix 9, Patrick Mahomes 10, Kyler Murray 11, and Brock Purdy 12. And see, this is where points per game, this is where you would look at points per game because Jared Goff is 6, Jalen Hurts is 7. But if you look at fantasy points per game, those two actually flip-flop, right? And Jalen Hurts, because Jalen Hurts missed week 17, where Jared Goff didn't. So Jared Goff has 0.1 more points than Jalen Hurts. But when you look at the points per game aspect, you say, okay, well, which guy would I rather have every single week? And the answer there is Jalen Hurts, just because he's going to have, he obviously averaged more points per game, not by much, but averaged more points per game and scored more fantasy points, or scored almost the same amount of fantasy points in less than, or in one less game than Jared Goff. So, but main takeaways from this, obviously Jaden Daniels finishing as the quarterback 4. It's actually very interesting if you look at, and we're not going to do that now, but I encourage you to go and look at this on your own. But Jaden Daniels' rookie season is very, very comparable in almost every category to Lamar Jackson's first MVP season back in 2019. So crazy to think that Jaden Daniels comes in as a rookie and is able to perform at this level. We didn't get a chance to talk all season stuff, as I did not really do any of the normal shows that I had done in the past, which is, breakout quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, sleepers, my guys, bus. But Jaden Daniels 100% would have been my breakout quarterback. Just throwing that out there. Now, obviously, that sounds like, oh, well, John, after the fact, hindsight's 2020. But if you've been listening to the show, you've been listening to me for a while, you know that Jaden Daniels fits the mold for me of what I'm looking for in my breakout quarterbacks, especially when they come in as rookies, because that's the cheapest they'll be. And Jaden Daniels is currently, he was the cheapest that he would be. And I think he'll be looked at as a top 3 option at the position next year, just because of what he can do with his legs, and as well as, the ability that he has as a passer. He's a very good passer already at this stage of his career, but he's obviously a very good runner as well. 800 rushing yards in his rookie season. So Sam Darnold had quite the resurgence. Is it likely that he finishes as a top 12 quarterback? I don't know. It's going to be dependent on some landing spots there. Brock Purdy, I think, has higher of a ceiling than the QB 12, coincidentally. But you have to look at some guys behind him and see, could they finish above him next year? Guys like Justin Herbert or Caleb Williams. So, Bo Nix had a pretty solid rookie season, 9th at the quarterback position in fantasy scoring. So, that makes you wonder as well, what is it going to look like for him next season? All right, let's move on to the running back position. And the top 3 running backs in 2024 season were Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Bijan Robinson. Now, Saquon Barkley obviously had a season definitely worth, talking about. Had over 2,000 rushing yards, was 101 yards short of Eric Dickerson's record. Obviously Eric Dickerson had done it in I think it was 16-game season for Eric Dickerson. So Saquon Barkley, had he played that 17th game, there people would have talked about an asterisk. I care about that, but also at the same time, I really don't. I like to see, phenomenal performances, and Saquon Barkley was having a phenomenal season, and he deserved to have his name etched in history because of the season that he had. Jahmyr Gibbs definitely, really took off there. Had over 1,400 rushing yards on the season, 16 rushing touchdowns, also added 517 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns on 52 receptions. I think, was it last year when Jahmyr Gibbs was a rookie? He was a breakout running back for me last year, and people were concerned about him and David Montgomery and the usage and what that would look like. And I remember saying at the time, I think best case scenario for Jahmyr Gibbs in year 1 would be for him to have an Alvin Kamara-like season, which he really did end up having, right? And if you had told me year 2 that he would have, a year that Alvin Kamara has never had, then I would have been like, yeah, I'll sign me up for that. But I don't know how probable that is. Well, he did, right? and I'm not talking about in terms of touchdowns because Alvin Kamara has scored 20 touchdowns in the season. Actually, he scored 21 touchdowns back in 2020. That was his fourth year in the league. But Alvin Kamara has never had a 1,000-yard season. And here's Jahmyr Gibbs running for 1,400 yards, right? So I think Jahmyr Gibbs is definitely cementing himself as one of the top backs in the league. I think he's already cemented himself as one of the top backs in the league. And when you look at it from like a dynasty perspective, is there a running back that you would rather have outside of Jahmyr Gibbs? And I'm pretty confident that the answer there is no, right? I mean, you could make the argument for Bijan Robinson, who comes in as the RB3 on the season. But to me, I would take Gibbs. I mean, I would have a hard time not taking Gibbs. So as we round out this top 12 here, what does that look like? Derrick Henry coming in at 4, Devon Achane coming in at 5, Josh Jacobs 6, Kyron Williams 7, Alvin Kamara 8, James Cook 9, Chase Brown 10, James Conner 11, and Chuba Hubbard coming in as the running back 12. Now, again, you look at fantasy points per game, Alvin Kamara actually ends up, he would be the running back 5, average 19 points per game, did miss the final 2 games of the fantasy season, missed obviously missed week 18. And Chuba Hubbard would come in at 10 as he missed the final week of the fantasy season there as well. So, when I look at this list of running backs, I mean, Alvin Kamara getting up there in age, hasn't really had much competition for touches. The Saints are going through a coaching change right now, so there's also the possibility that they could have a change of philosophy in terms of how they utilize running backs, things of that nature. Shout out to Josh Jacobs. I mean, he was an absolute beast this year. I actually anticipated a season like this from Josh Jacobs. Maybe, when I look at it statistically, I mean, I honestly can't even say that I didn't see something like this. I mean, just being in Green Bay, being the primary running back, the lack of competition for opportunities there. I thought that he was in line for a really good season, and he went ahead and had that. Let's move on to the wide receiver position here. And the top 3 guys at the position: Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, Jamar Chase, obviously he was having, great season there. Being the primary I don't want to say he was the primary target for Joe Burrow, but there was a lot of time that he spent as the top target for Joe Burrow with, T. Higgins dealing with some injuries, and he ends up with that's not his stat line, but I believe he had 1,700 yards receiving, ends up with 17 touchdowns. It was just a phenomenal year there for Jamar Chase. And then Justin Jefferson, people were weary of him coming into the year because they thought that it would be hard for him to repeat the success that he has had throughout his career, catching passes from Sam Darnold, who, for the most part has struggled in his career. So it was definitely a situation there where if you were getting Justin Jefferson, you were most likely getting him at a discount relative to how he finished on the year. But let's round out this top 12 wide receivers here, because it's an interesting list and how it comes together. But in terms of total fantasy points, right? And this is the position, if I could pick one position to look at from a fantasy points per game perspective, just one, it would be wide receiver. Because there's a lot of randomness that happens. Um, and these guys, they miss 1 or 2 games and they have a lot of blow up games. And so the points per game, I think, really captures the season long impact that these guys had. At running back, yeah, you could look at it that way, but at the same time, running backs, they tend to miss more games than a wide receiver. So you could have a guy that's like, oh yeah, he played 5 games and he averaged like 21 points a game, but like, do you want that guy if he's, you have questions about his durability or maybe the injury and how he's going to come back from that. So it's just things to consider. But uh, we'll look at the points. We'll look at the total fantasy points, and then we'll talk through the fantasy points per game aspect of it. But Brian Thomas Jr. comes in as the wide receiver 4, CeeDee Lamb 5, Malik Neighbors 6, Jackson Smith-Njigba 7, Terry McLaurin 8, Garrett Wilson 9, Drake London 10, Jerry Jeudy 11, and Ladd McConkey coming in at 12. So, big takeaways. Brian Thomas coming here at 4 is absolute nasty work. Like, that's crazy. But when you look at it from a fantasy points per game perspective, CeeDee Lamb, actually Malik Neighbors would have been the wide receiver 4. Malik Neighbors quietly had a very spectacular season, actually. When you look at Neighbors, 1,200 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, 109 catches. Um, he was had a very, very great rookie season. All of that while missing 2 games, right? So he would have actually been the wide receiver 4. CeeDee Lamb would have been the wide receiver 5, 17.6 points per game. Then you could look at, you actually have to go even lower down the list. You got guys like Puka Nacua, who actually should have been the wide receiver 3, 18.8 points per game, but he only played 11 games and actually comes in as the wide receiver 21 in total fantasy points. And you've got guys like Mike Evans, 13 total games, 17.1 fantasy points per game. You've got Devontae Adams, 17 points per game. Only played 13 games as he was having his holdout with the Raiders. Yeah, guys, my camera is doing some stuff here. So if you're watching live, I apologize for that. If you're watching on YouTube, even after the fact, I also apologize for that. No idea what's going on with the camera here today. So definitely get that worked out. But we'll power through it. We'll power through it for sure. So these guys here definitely had great seasons as well. Jackson Smith-Njigba, he turned on like the almost back half of the season when DK Metcalf had suffered that injury. And then he really started to take on a role, and I think he's going to hold on to that mantle going forward. It'll be him and DK Metcalf as opposed to DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Jerry Jeudy, he had that blow up game near the end of the against Denver, but still continued to have some really solid performances down the stretch there. Drake London. He had to deal with quite a bit of quarterback situation there, but I think he ultimately gave you a performance that you really were looking for. Terry McLaurin, it was quiet to start the year, but then as Jaden Daniels really started to heat up as a passer, Terry McLaurin was the primary benefactor of that as a wide receiver. So that's really it that sticks out to me. Nico Collins as well. He's another guy, 17.8 PPR points per game, would have been in the top 6 or 7 of wide receivers this year. So, wide receiver is always fun. I can't wait to go back next year and go back in this offseason and just kind of project all these guys out. I was asked on Sirius XM on Friday night, where I think a guy like Lad McConkey comes in next year. McConkey, 15 PPR points per game, probably have him in the wide receiver 15 to 16 range next year. But when I stat it all out, you guys will be the first to know. So let's talk through the tight end position. And the number one tight end on the season, not sure how many people saw this one coming, but Brock Bowers. The tight end 2, George Kittle. Tight end 3, Trey McBride. Now, I think Brock Bowers is going to be the tight end 1 for the foreseeable future going forward. I mean, did only average 15.5 PPR points per game, but that was in his rookie season. Broke the record for most receiving yards by a tight end, broke the rookie reception record as well with 112. So it was just a all around like a really good year there for Brock Bowers. But I think going forward, he will be the tight end 1, the quintessential tight end 1. Now, where does that rank him in terms of, where would we draft him? Is he a first round pick? I don't know if he's there yet. I don't know if he's at that first round pick, uh, place yet, but I think definitely second round. Like, we have to be looking at Brock Bowers, just the advantage that he gives you at the position. But I think he's clearly it. I think after Brock Bowers is probably going forward going to be a guy like Trey McBride. He to have the season he had and only score 1 touchdown all year, 15.4 points per game. I definitely this shows the consistency that he has. George Kittle, I mean, it almost feels like every time I draft George Kittle nowadays, it's almost like drafting Marshawn Lynch at the end of his career. It's like, when are the wheels going to fall off? George Kittle plays the game, a very physical manner. So, does suffer some injuries. So it makes you wonder, like, how long is he going to keep this up? But, I felt like a fool not having very much George Kittle this year and having way too much Kyle Pitts, which, I never want to talk about him again. Rounding out the top 12 tight ends, Jonnu Smith coming in as the tight end 4, Travis Kelce 5, Mark Andrews 6, Zach Ertz 7, Samuel Laporta 8, Tucker Kraft 9, David Njoku 10, Pat Frymuth 11, and Hunter Henry coming in as the tight end 12. This is another position I know I said wide receiver, but tight end is very, very similar vein where I would look at points per game, because you look at a guy like Cade Otton, who came in as a tight end 13 in total fantasy points. But if you look at it from a points per game perspective, he's actually within that top 12 of the position, while guys like Hunter Henry and Pat Frymuth most likely are not. Now, if you had told anybody, I mean, I would have believed you. But if you told anybody else, after the way people were freaking out about Mark Andrews after the first 3 weeks of the season, that he would finish as a tight end 1, I feel like people would not believe you. But here we are. Zach Ertz having the year he had, resurgent year for him. So get that Ben Sinnott, those Ben Sinnott stocks ready to go, because we know what happens when Zach Ertz plays in front of a tight end. Tucker Kraft, I think he was a very useful tight end streamer that became a tight end starter for many of us in the fantasy community. Jonnu Smith, talked about him a decent amount in the waiver show, and then for weeks it just wasn't hitting, and all of a sudden, boom, tight end 4 season. So it's kind of crazy how those things happen. But yeah, Kyle Pitts, let's say this now that I'm done with him, but you know how this goes. Feels like I'm in, and I'm not even going to say that. Anyway, let's get into some accountability stuff, right? this is always fun to look at, and I mean, at least for me, I get so like dialed in on a week to week basis, and I'm always looking at the last 3 weeks, and um, it's not often that I get to step away and take a full scope view at the landscape, and see at the end of the season, okay, how did these guys come? How did these guys perform? How do they stack up? So it's fun to it's a good exercise for me to at least do that. Just because, again, like I said, I get so dialed in on the over the last 3 weeks, or this particular span of the season, or and because we're just looking for those trends, right? We're looking for, okay, hey, this guy was performing well, but he's not anymore. Should we flip him? Or this guy wasn't performing well, but now he is. Should we buy him? Right. So things like that. So this is always fun for me to do. So let's get into the accountability stuff. And if you're in the comment section, feel free to jump in here. If you're watching live, feel free to jump in. Highly encouraged. But the thing you guys are all here to see is me talk about the things that I got wrong or things I got right. So let's talk about some accountability, some matchup show year-end recap. So if you've been listening all year, the matchup show is essentially me going through the Fantasy Pros expert consensus rankings, identifying guys at the running back, wide receiver position that are outside, that are ranked outside the top 20, bringing them in here, and essentially saying, hey, you should play this guy, you should not play this guy, or you should play this guy. He's ranked outside the top 20. He deserves to be in your lineup. I think he finishes higher than what his ECR is. If at the quarterback position and tight end position, we're looking at guys that are ranked outside that top 10, and we're doing the same thing there. And then also at the same time, we're looking at guys that are ranked inside those same thresholds and saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't play this guy. Maybe you, should look at other options, or maybe you should, this guy's ranked really high. I don't think that they'll meet that. Maybe you might want to supplement your lineup by adding, another high upside player. I wouldn't totally bench them, but maybe you want to supplement your lineup. So, on a given week, I can give out anywhere from, in a full week, I can give out 16 recommendations. I think as the season goes on a little bit longer, I might give out even more recommendations. Obviously bye weeks, because I'm trying to give a player like 1 or 2 players from every game. Sometimes I'll give out 3 players from every game. So we did the show for 18 weeks. Over the course of an 18-week season, we gave out 297 recommendations. That's about 16 and a half players or recommendations per week. So yeah, pretty consistent. I mean, you look at this list, it's like 16, 16, 16, 16. So again, I gave out 297 recommendations, nearly 300. Of those recommendations, and as we know, or if you've been listening, we talk about big hits, which is guys that exceeded their ECR by 10 or more points or 10 or more spots. We talk about hits, which is a guy that just exceeded their ECR. We talk about big misses, which is a guy that failed to meet their ECR by 10 or more points, or misses, which is a guy that just failed to meet his ECR. And if we're looking at the reverse of that, then, if we recommended not to play a guy, if they beat their ECR by, 10 or more points, that's a big miss. If they fail to meet their ECR by 10 or more spots, that's a big hit. And then obviously you could figure out the rest of that there. So of the 297 recommendations, 48% of them were either a big hit or a hit. 48% of them were either a big miss or a miss. And the rest falls into categories of a guy that was a DNP, or a guy that tied his ECR. So it's pretty much 50-50 in terms of the guys that turned out to be hits, whether a big hit or a hit, and the guys that turned out to either be a big miss or a miss. So 30% of them were big hits, 18% were hits, 32% were big misses, 16% were misses. The best week that I had was actually week 1, coincidentally enough. Of the 16 recommendations, um, 9 of them were big hits, including 5 guys that finished inside the top 10 of their position. And then we had 2 players who finished as top 2 players at their position, with Jaden Reed as the finish as a wide receiver 1 that week, and then Baker Mayfield as the quarterback 2 on the week. Now, we also hit on some real under the radar guys like Brian Thomas that week, Khalil Shakir, and Bo Nix, actually all guys who would go on to make an impact throughout the remainder of the season. You could even add Baker Mayfield to that list as a guy that fit the bill, who we talked about in that week 1 matchup show, and then went on to make an impact the rest of the season. And then we had Colby Parkinson, who would go on to not make an impact the rest of the season. The worst week of the season was week 3, actually, as 50% of the 16 recommendations were big misses, as we had guys who, simply just underperformed in that spot. We had 8 of the 16 not, basically missed their ECR by 10 spots or more. And we had some names on here too, right? Like DeAndre Swift, Derek Carr. I'll never forget that one. Actually, Derek Carr, it was after his 2 back-to-back like QB1 performances, not QB1 overall, but like really good QB performances, when the crime rate in New Orleans was like extremely low, and they were saying like, oh, it's because the Saints are winning, right? It was that time. And then Derek Carr does what he does, and when you recommend him, he face plants. Rashid Shaheed, George Pickens was involved in there. I think he had a matchup against Atlanta, most likely. I want, or was that week 1 he had a matchup against Atlanta? I think that was the week he had a matchup against Atlanta. But George Pickens didn't come through for us. And then Jameson Williams, I mean, it almost felt like every time I picked Jameson Williams throughout the year, it just didn't work out. He is so volatile of a player. Just that one didn't work out. And then Geno Smith, that also week 3, just didn't do great there. So when I think about it, right, like, why did I do so well, and why was week 1 my best week? And honestly, I feel like it's because I came into the offseason. I came out of the offseason, out of doing my projections, having an idea about some of the guys that I would like to target, right? Some of the guys that I would, I was heavy on in drafts per se. And we'll touch on that a little bit, because Brian Thomas is a guy that I did not have a ton of draft capital on, but I think the drumbeat was getting louder for Brian Thomas as we approached the regular season. And so therefore it was, by this point, it was very, I wanted Brian Thomas as much as I can get him, even though at that point I couldn't get him. It was too late. So Bo Nix, obviously a guy that, I talked about all season. So I came into the year already kind of high on him, and, just expected him to perform well. And I thought that he could have taken advantage of that Seattle matchup week 1. And he didn't quite come through as a QB1, right? I think he finished as a QB20 that week, but he was ranked QB32. So I remember saying at the time, like, you could be a streamer, you could be, if you're in a deep league, if you're in a 2 quarterback league, Bo Nix probably a good pickup, or solid pickup, and potentially a solid start, which he turned out to be a solid start for a 2 quarterback league that week. But why was week 3 my worst week? Honestly, can't tell you. Sometimes when I looked at some of these performances, there were these guys that you know there was a lot of different circumstances. Sometimes it was just a bad week. Sometimes the matchup isn't as good as I think it is, right? And so or you're just banking on Derek Carr, which never really goes well for you. So uh, all these things that I definitely need to consider, and I'll look at this a little bit more. I didn't really have a whole ton of. Um, I didn't really look at this in a very deep manner. I just was trying to look at the overall stats of it, and you know see where we were. But more want to improve on these numbers definitely next year. It was the first time doing this segment, so definitely want to improve it next year. Let's recap some of the starts of the week, right? And we'll go through some of the best calls, some of the worst calls. Some of the best calls. Week 1, Jaden Daniels was my start of the week. Finishes a QB3 versus Tampa. Week 2, Baker Mayfield and Chris Godwin with the stack against Detroit. Baker is the QB5. Chris Godwin is the wide receiver 6. The Garrett Wilson blow-up game in week 5 as the wide receiver 5. After having such a slow start to the season, had a phenomenal game against Minnesota in London. Then we had Caleb Williams come in as the quarterback 1 in Jacksonville. That was, I remember that week actually pretty well, as he was also in London. Kyle Pitts, the tight end 2 overall against Tampa Bay in week 8. Week 14, we had Isaac Garendo, the RB2, and Jordan Addison, the wide receiver 3, um, Chicago and Atlanta, respectively, in week 14. Championship week, we had Baker Mayfield finishing as a quarterback 2 in week 17, and week 18 championship week, Drake London as the wide receiver 1, also against Carolina in week 18. Some of the worst calls of the year. Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 78 versus Tampa Bay in week 1. Michael Wilson, the wide receiver 73 versus Washington in week 4. Kyle Pitts, the tight end 39 against Dallas in week 9. I remember being very upset about that one because I'm like, are there even 39 tight ends in fantasy? Like, this is crazy. Obviously, there are, but that's a joke. But like 39 tight ends, like, that's crazy. Sam Darnold, the QB 25 against Jacksonville in week 10. That one hurt. Russell Wilson, the QB 27 versus Baltimore week 11. Tucker Kraft, tight end 57 against Chicago, also in week 11. Caleb Williams, the quarterback 17 versus San Fran in week 14. Terry McLaurin, the wide receiver 111 versus Atlanta in week 17 championship week. And then week 18, other championship week, was a bad week, all in all. Sam Darnold, the quarterback 28 against Detroit. Zach Charbonnet, the running back 30 against Los Angeles Rams. And Chig Okonkwo, the tight end 85 versus Houston in week 18. So, some of these bad calls, I actually, they stick with me. I remember them vividly. I mean, the Michael Wilson one, I believe that Marvin Harrison Jr. was banged up. Washington seemed like a good matchup against wide receivers. But little did I know at that point in time that you can't rely on Kyler Murray unless he's throwing to Trey McBride. Sam Darnold against Jacksonville, that one. Jacksonville had been hemorrhaging points to wide receiver position all year, and Sam Darnold was in the midst of having his great season, and went into Jacksonville and played extremely poorly. Russell Wilson against Baltimore, that game, probably also around the same time that Baltimore started turning it around defensively. They had made some changes in their secondary, and that obviously Russell Wilson's not the Steelers want to play a game where they run the ball as much as they can, play action. Russell Wilson throws the ball down the field. Like, that's how they want to play. They don't want Russell Wilson or any quarterback right now throwing the ball 30, 40 times a game. Baltimore, since Pittsburgh did win that game, it was a low scoring game. And that's probably the way Pittsburgh would have wanted to keep it. Caleb Williams against San Fran in Week 14. I remember that one because I had like a little bit of hesitation going into the start of the week, but I wanted to. I felt like San Fran had just allowed some fantasy points. Um, they Caleb Williams was playing a little bit better in terms of, I'm not, you don't want to say a little bit better, but he was using his legs as well. He was running the ball, so thought that he could have taken advantage of that. Turned out to get benched at the end of the game for Tyson Bagent. Terry McLaurin against Atlanta in Week 17, that one kind of hurt because we're just watching Olamide Zaccheaus just have all the fantasy production while Terry McLaurin's just getting clamped by AJ Terrell. And then Sam Darnold, Detroit, he just imploded similar to what he did last night in the wild card game on Monday night. And then Chigakonkwo had a 0. I don't know if he was dealing with an injury in Week 18. And Zach Charbonnet just underwhelmed. Let's look at the waiver wire pickups to end the year, or throughout the year. Some of the top ones: Baker Mayfield, we talked about very early on. We talked about Sam Darnold throughout the first few weeks of the season. Like I said, we talked about Johnny Smith from the time that Tua Tagovailoa came back. We talked about Zach Ertz early on in the year. Bucky Irving, we spoke about in Week 4. He went on to finish as the running back 13. Bo Nix, we talked about Bo Nix like literally every week to start the year. But I remember saying in Week 9 that he was rostered in 25% of leagues. And if you were listening to this podcast, you were probably in that 25% of leagues, and you're probably in the 13% of people that started him that week. And then Justin Herbert, we were banging the drum for Justin Herbert as well. Misses. Carson Steele in Week 4. That one hurt, man, because I spent way too much fab on Carson Steele. I advised people here to spend fab on Carson Steele, and it turned out to be Kareem Hunt for free. There was also the Russell Wilson. He flopped basically almost every time that we were, he had a couple of good games, but overall, like, I don't think Russell Wilson really helped anybody win their fantasy leagues. So, that's another one that, we could have gone Justin Herbert. We could have gone Bo Nix, which we did, right? But Russell Wilson didn't help us. Every week that I brought up Jalen Wright, it felt like, it was just bringing him up all the time, and he never did anything. And then there's the Jerry Jeudy conundrum, right? Because I would bring up Jerry Jeudy every single week. I talk about it in the matchup show, and he would fail to meet expectations in the matchup show, but everything was there in terms of the targets. The production wasn't wasn't following. The quarterback situation was really crappy. Deshaun Watson was playing very poorly at the time, but he was just seeing these targets, and guys, like Jerry Jeudy. And then the Amari Cooper trade happens. Cedric Tillman has the game of his life, and I think I just got, at that point, tunnel vision for Cedric Tillman, because I recommended actually ditching Jerry Jeudy and jumping ship to Cedric Tillman. Just for Jeudy to go on and have a fantastic rest of season there. So, Cedric, that one definitely hurts, because that actually impacted me in my personal leagues as well. So I was there with you guys. Now let's move on to lessons learned, right? So, and just to give you guys an idea of what's up next, so lessons learned, and then we're going to talk about what's ahead for this 2025 off season, and we'll talk a little bit of football, but don't have a whole lot of time because I did want to keep this one under an hour. So when we're pushing up against this, so we'll get going. But my biggest lesson learned in 2025 is that I need to get back into my process of looking at the whole season from the off season to the start of the fantasy season. As I touched on before, I had been dealing with some personal stuff over the last couple of years. It was really impacting my mental health, my ability to my desire to really get on here and talk to you guys from a fantasy perspective. And then the season would come around, and I'd feel like almost this sense of obligation, right, that I had to be here. And I'll be 100% honest with you guys, like I almost didn't do it this year. Um, but I had a talk with a friend in the fantasy football community, and that friend, they gave me a pep talk that I think I really needed to hear at the time. And they gave me some suggestions about some things I could do uh, to help me find the joy again in doing this. And I really did. And so um, I'm my plan is to be back here with you guys in the off season, through the start of the fantasy season, right? If you listen to this show in the past, I mean, we were on here. I was on here at least once every other week. I think at some points even once a week throughout the off season, and then eventually that we we had guest spots. We jumped right into, like, literally from the off season right into the fantasy season, and it was, I remember that year vividly. It was like one of the most fun years that I had in this space doing this stuff. And I felt like super plugged into like everything that was happening from a fantasy perspective. And there were players that it was just like, hey, that player is going to do this, that player is going to do that. And it was like those things were hitting. And even when they weren't hitting, it was like I had a clear understanding of why they didn't. So I felt like the fact that I wasn't so plugged in this year, it caused me to miss out on guys like a Bucky Irving, like a Brian Thomas, where Bucky Irving in my prospect model graded as one of the top running backs in the class. But because I was so disconnected, I wasn't sitting there, following my normal process, which would have been, hey, what's the model say? Okay, let me go watch some film of these guys, and then, ranking them based on, what the model says, what my eyes see, and then what the people I trust are saying as well. And I did not do that this offseason. So a guy like Bucky Irving, completely under the radar. A guy like Brian Thomas, I mean, I've seen Brian Thomas play football. That one's just a pure miss on my part. I think I just let um, the situation that he was landing in really impact my thought process, which in the past I had never really like done, because I'm always like draft the player, not the situation. I always think best player available. And in the dynasty lens, I just should have been higher on Brian Thomas. I questioned his year one production way too much because of his situation. And that caused me to really to not value him as high as I should have coming into this year. So, um, so my biggest lesson in 2024, my biggest lesson learned is that I just got to stay committed. I got to stay in my process, because again, it has worked for me in the past. Um, and I think I'm in a better place. I know I'm in a better place now, mentally, to be able to carry this on and and you know bring bring to it what I know I'm capable of bringing, but also what you guys deserve and need every time you guys hit play on a podcast or hit play on a video or tune into the live stream. So I look forward to delivering that. Um, yeah, I didn't mean to take it there with you guys today, but I just want to be honest, want to be transparent. I know obviously people are always dealing with something, and you never know what they're dealing with too, right? So that's why we got to be kind to one another. That's why we got to love up on one another. That's why we got to support one another. Because again, at the end of the day, you never know somebody's story. You never know what they're going through. And what I was going through, it's nothing like life or death, right? I wasn't sick. I just was dealing with a situation, in my personal life that was really impacting me, mentally, emotionally, um, just even my attitude and how I interacted with people was different too. Um, and I needed to just, I guess, have that time to myself to really reflect and to really, work on myself and I work on my mentals as well. Um, to get back to this place that I'm at now where I can get on this mic and get in front of this camera and talk to you guys and really enjoy it, right? Really be present, because there were times where I was even on here in the last couple of seasons and I'm just, I was going through the motions. Um, so for that I apologize as well. So um yeah, if anybody's ever going through something, you guys want to talk about it, my DMs are open. Um, you know, you guys, again, you never know what people are going through. So be kind to one another. All right, now that that stuff is over with, let's see what's next for the 2025 season, right? What is this show going to look like as we move forward, right? So things that you can expect from me going forward, right? 2025 projections, that's my top priority, what I'm going to be working on these actually through the end of this month. Um, Projecting out the 2025 season as best as we can right now with the information that we have. And seeing, kind of looking ahead to 2025, who are the top players at the position? Who are the guys that had really great seasons this year? What does that look like going into next year, right? How high are we going to be on some of these guys that, like a Brian Thomas, like a, trying to think of another, like a Chase Brown or like a Bucky Irving, right? Like, where are we going to be? How high are we going to be on these guys as we move forward? Um, and then as these things are changing, right, the head coaching hires, that's going to impact the fantasy landscape, right? Maybe we get a Ben Johnson going to Chicago. Okay, what is that? When we stat out the Chicago Bears, what does that look like, right? um, what's the free agency and trades, right? We're going to look at how that impacts the fantasy landscape, different landing spots, right? One of the things I remember is getting on here when the day Kenny Galladay signed with the Giants, right? And telling you guys, like, I don't like this. I do not like this, not one bit. I mean, granted, it turned out to be even worse than what I thought, but as soon as that free agency happened, I was like, I'm getting rid of all my Kenny Galladay stock, right? And I did, and so reacting to some of those things through a dynasty lens, right? If you're playing dynasty, reacting to some of those things, but also looking at dynasty prospects, right? Like some of these incoming rookies, running them through my model, trying to get an understanding of where they fall, relative to this class. Um, Trying to taking a look at them throughout the entire process, right? From the day they declare to the combine, right? How does that impact, what are we seeing there that might shift, move them up and down the rankings, right? And then from that moment on, right, we literally will spend that whole time just kind of projecting landing spots, um, draft capital, right? Because once we know, like, hey, once this guy gets this capital, if this guy gets this capital, we know what to do, right? If this guy, doesn't get this capital, that's going to make him, it's going to make him look like this. And then once the draft hits, we'll just rank them, right? So, we'll start doing that once we get uh, to or around the combine, right? That'll start happening. Um, and then last but not least, probably most likely, going to have some guest spots on here, right? As we move through the fantasy season, looking at guys, uh, looking at people in the fantasy community, interacting with them, building connections, and bringing them on this show. And giving you guys another perspective. Maybe they're people that you already listen to, you already consume their content in the fantasy community, but highlighting some folks who I think are doing really good work in the fantasy space, and wanting to bring them on here to interact with them and let you who listen get that perspective as well. All right, wild card weekend. Terrible football games outside of the Washington Commanders and the Tampa Bay Bucks. My biggest surprise of the weekend was definitely the Houston Texans beating up the Chargers the way they did. I thought the Chargers would win that game. I think a lot of people thought the Chargers would win that game. And Houston, being a home team, just absolutely mollywopped the LA Chargers. Expected uh, Baltimore to dominate the Steelers. Um, expected the Rams to really beat up on the Vikings. I expected the Commanders to beat the Bucks in a close game. The Commanders having to play the Bucks kind of sucked for me because I thought that the Bucks and the Commanders were both teams that could have gone in and really surprised somebody. In the first round of the playoffs, and then they had to play each other, which I didn't like one bit, but it is what it is. But I was riding with the Commanders there, so also happy for my little bro who is a Commanders fan through and through. So, um, glad that he was able to see Commanders playoff win for the first time since 2005, 20 years, right? So, what is the divisional round? What are we excited to see? Uh, I'm excited to see the Commanders go to Detroit, right? I mean, they're 8.5-point dogs going into Detroit. I think Jaden Daniels is the. I said this on Sirius on Friday, but as the lights get brighter, Jaden Daniels gets better. So I'm excited to see him in this matchup on Saturday night, 8 p.m. against this Detroit Lions team that has been red hot. I don't think the Commanders win that game, but I think they'll keep it closer than the 8.5. The Houston Texans against the Kansas City Chiefs. That game takes place 4:30 on Saturday. I think the Chiefs win that game. I think you could pretty much punch their ticket to the AFC Championship game right now. The spread right now, Texans plus 7.5. I actually think that line should be closer to like 5.5, but I still think the Chiefs pull that one out. The Eagles and the Rams. That's Sunday at 3 p.m. Now that game, the Eagles to me are the epitome of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, right? They like 1 week they could look like the best team in the league when they're beating up on a team like Baltimore, and then another week they are not playing so well. Their game against the Packers, they looked absolutely terrible. But that game should be exciting. I mean, Sean McVay is going to coach his ass off. I'm sure of that. But both these defenses, the Rams and the Eagles, really, really active defensive fronts, really opportunistic secondaries. I think the Eagles probably get the edge there. The Eagles did lose linebacker Nakobe Dean, but I think that the Eagles have the edge there, so should probably see them in the NFC championship game. Although I did a pick bracket like a couple weeks ago. I have the Rams facing the Lions in an NFC championship game, so not going to be surprised if that happens. But right now, and again, that's going to sound crazy, but I made that pick like a couple weeks ago. And right now, as I'm sitting here, it feels like the Eagles should win this game, but we'll see. And then Baltimore versus Buffalo. Baltimore 1.5-point favorites on the road. I expect Baltimore to win this game. I'm rooting for Baltimore to win this game, Jet fan. So I don't want to see anything good for Buffalo. And don't hear what I'm not saying, right? I mean, actually, I said it, so you're hearing it. But don't get me wrong. If I was an objective football fan, I would absolutely like I see the appeal for Buffalo, right? Like a very talented quarterback. They've got um, they've got the city of Buffalo is, Buffalo fans, I think, are nice people for the most part. Um, they're players, right? They don't have like, they don't have like, big names that you're like, oh, this guy, he's such a star, right? It's like just Josh Allen and his buddies, right? Like they call James Cook Jimbo, right? Like Khalil Shakir is like an easy player to root for. I get all of that. Totally get all of that. I just don't want anything good for the Buffalo Bills. Like nothing. And I'm totally okay saying that. Now, in this game, I like well, Freudian slip, right? I like Baltimore. I think, the last time these teams played was 31-10. Baltimore really gave it to them. Now you're going to do that again in their house. Remains to be seen, but Lamar Jackson's playing football as good as anybody right now. So I got to go with him, and I've got to go with Baltimore. So we'll see what happens. But my NFC Championship, man, I'm going to stick with my original pick. I'm going to say Rams, Lions, and then AFC Championship, Chiefs, Ravens. But until next time, I will see y'all. Maybe 2 weeks. We'll call it 2 weeks. If I do come on next week, it'll be very short. But I'll plan on coming on in 2 weeks. If I come on next week, it'll literally be just to talk conference championship. So it might even be like 15 minutes tops. But definitely will catch me on here in 2 weeks. By then, we'll know who's in the Super Bowl. And by then, I'll have some more updates for you guys. But until next time, y'all, have a good one. I love you. I appreciate you. And we'll talk soon. Peace.